we're here for another sculpture forum. And this time we're going to talk about Gaston Lachaise. And the excuse for doing this is the installation of one of his works, A Floating Woman, in New York, looking out over the, I think that's the East River towards the UN building. And this is a recent cast that's been installed for a year. We all went to see it. And when I say we all, that is the people participating in this forum, which are the usual crew: Jock, the wonderful Jock Ireland, Brandt, Junceau. And on this occasion, we have we're joined by Choghakate from Paris. I should credit Rachael Bohlander, who is now recording this and who will edit it and may chip in with a word here and there. We all met to look at this thing and talk about it a bit. And anybody who's looking at this forum should first look at the marvelous piece Brandt did about this sculpture, which we posted just very recently as a one-off post with Brandt talking about this amazing sculpture. So that's our starting point. But I think Lachaise is well worth revisiting. He seems to me to be an artist that's been completely overlooked in the present day, problematic in many ways, perhaps misunderstood in many ways. It seems to me, and perhaps someone else will have an opinion or correct me, but it seems to me this particular sculpture, The Floating Woman, is not typical of his work. I mean, it's typical in that it's a nude female, but in any other way, it's not typical. And perhaps was a one-off, perhaps relates more closely to some of the more sexually explicit work that he was doing later. So I'll open it up now to, unless I've forgotten to say something, but Brandt, you're the authority here, or at least you're the one who I regard as the person who is far more knowledgeable about Lachaise than I am. So what's your thought about this work being a kind of one-off?
Well, it really is. I mean, there are a few horizontal pieces in the body of his work, most notably the mountain, which is deliberate landscape. But there's none other that really loses contact with the support as this does, and so deliberately. And the sad thing is that it's a lateral move that was not followed up, and I feel strongly that it really might have. Although there's a 7-year lag between his making the full-size plaster and the casting, in which he apparently didn't touch it. But I still like to think that it would have been developed. It's certainly as a monumental bronze among his other work. It's notably underdeveloped, especially for a guy who had such a strong decorative sense and such a strong kind of professional sense of finish.
Yeah, the finish is one thing. But the thing that's kind of like I was partly thinking about was the extent to which this figure has been kind of abstracted. I mean, the forms are no longer anatomically bear any really close relationship to, a real human being, and that sense in which the the level of abstraction, the level of deviation away from and towards what, I'm not sure, but towards something that is much more geometric, I guess, struck me as significant. And again, something that I don't think he followed up.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty surely, I mean, as extreme as some of the latest and smallest pieces are, I think it's still in a way the least literal piece he made.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good word, least literal.
In part, I think it's unique in his work because of the feeling. There's no other piece of his that has this kind of feeling.
Yeah, when I went to see it, and I walked, got out of my car, found a parking place, got out of my car, walked, found it, and saw it in the distance. I thought it was just delightful. As I walked towards it, it seemed really joyful and really delightful. And when I got to it and began to spend a little time with it, I began to find it weirder and weirder.
Yeah.
I mean, in a way that was kind of like not disappointing, but just kind of puzzling and exciting. It asked all kinds of questions about, how did you get there?
That's a funny thing about Lachaise. There's a kind of obscurity without mystery.
Yes. Choghakate, what do you think? I mean, I love having you here because, in a way, some of the things that are problematic about Lachaise are his relationship to women or to a woman.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Like, it's not so much his relationship between women and him. It's just that woman in particular, Isabel, his muse and mistress, then his wife. I'm very happy to be here today because I believe that Lachaise is a really exciting sculptor. And also one of the reasons also because it took me a while to fully appreciate him. I think the first time maybe it wasn't the first time I was seeing his work, but I confronted his work. It was probably a few years ago at an auction at Christie's. I believe it was Elevation, and I was traumatized by this sculpture. It was there at the entrance of the building, and it was huge, but not huge enough to become a monument or a building. It was just a little bigger than life. So it was still close but far, and I was terrified. It appeared to me very vulgar and overwhelming. And I was used to see naked women in public space. I grew up in Paris. I studied art history at the École du Louvre, which is literally inside the Louvre. And so I was used to have a picnic and lunch next to the sculptures of Mayol, but they were different women. They were bonier, more Mediterranean type of body. And with Lachaise, I don't know if it's probably more American type of body, fleshier, without bones. And there's this ambiguity between female men, because even this sculpture, because of the face, the large shoulders, his women are always ambiguous, although there's this huge breast that is hyper feminine, but there are other body parts that are quite masculine. I think this ambiguity makes it so difficult to apprehend. And also the body type of certain sculptures, they're not ideal, slender, athletic. They're the body of a lazy woman. And it's really, I think that's what is most shocking for many of his sculptures, and that there's a lot of flesh and lazy flesh. And I think today that's what kind of shocks you, because it just shows you this kind of expansion of flesh. And with this type of sculpture and this specific sculpture, I think you said it before, it seems that it's a real transition between the first part of his career where he was making either decorative works or more realistic ones, and the late works, and which are crazy. And in this specific floating woman, I believe it's also very ambiguous because she has an animal form, like a sea animal. I don't know what type, and probably the fact that she's above water makes you really believe that she's a sort of sea animal emerging from water because of this very abstracted geometric forms and also the position. And also there's another thing that struck me with the sculpture is, I mean, with Lachaise in general, that he's not interested in the extremities of the body. He's not into surrealistic classic foot or hands fetish. It's really about the torso, the breast, obviously, but also a lot about the belly, which is always very present. And I'm not surprised that he made so many torsos just separate. And with this sculpture, of which he made a different version with just without the hands and the feet. And what is also interesting here is that it's really floating. It's like an empty body. It's like it's a pneumatic body. It's really buoyant. And the later work is so different because it's as if the body is inside out. And in this case, it's only outside. It's like an empty balloon floating, literally.
Yeah, yeah, I think I concur with everything you've said.
You know, the marine illusion is interesting because the closest parallel to this piece, I think, is his dolphin fountain.
Yes, it's a bit dolphin-like.
Yeah, you see the same decorative reflexes in play.
Jock?
I don't I see Lachaise I guess through Sidney Geist, and I see him as a virtuoso. And Sidney talked about or what Sidney called golden fingertips or golden hands. He just had a gift for modeling in clay and just a gift for making sculpture. And it was a gift. He could make sculpture sort of without thinking. And I don't, it was interesting, Brandt, your comment about obscurity without mystery. I don't see him, he didn't put mystery into these things. He just sort of sat down with a banjo, and he was good at playing a banjo, and just songs came out. And that's plenty for me. You know, I'm delighted by his work in a way that, you know, I'm delighted by Renoir or Raphael. There's not a lot of mystery. There isn't the sort of plastic perfection that you see in Renoir or Raphael, but there is a sort of, I don't know, simple-minded is the wrong word, but it just a pure delight in making sculpture, in living in the world.
I can kind of see where you and Sidney are coming from in relation to that. Did Sidney know him? Do you know?
I don't remember his telling me any stories. Sidney was born in 1914. Lachaise died in 35, I think. So I don't think.
Yeah, he could have met him as a young man, possibly. I mean, when Sidney was a young man. And Lachaise
yeah, maybe. And I'm sure Sidney knew people who knew him
Yeah.
And when he made that comment about the golden fingertips, he said that that's the way we all thought of him.
Yeah.
You know,
I
his
mean,
generation of
yeah.
sculptors.
What you say is not inconsistent with my sense that there was a kind of underlying obsession, and I mean that almost in a literal, kind of pathological sense with him. That somehow this obsession was something that he worked with and through, and yet was sort of blinded by.
That's a good way to put it.
And exactly what the obsession was is not clear to me. Clearly, it obviously had to do with Isabel, but what was it? I mean, Isabel became the manifestation of it, as it were.
Right. It had to be older than her.
The embodiment of it, but yeah, it had to predate his meeting. I mean, when he met her, that was what it was able to focus on, and work, in relation to, become a slave to, in a sense.
Yeah, but he was simply, or I mean, maybe not simply, but he was in love with a woman, and that it just Raphael's Madonnas and little children, that it's a sort of simple, uncomplicated, pure love.
No, Jock, I can't accept that.
Okay.
Because the question I have to ask, I mean, I don't know how much time we want to spend talking about his relationship with Isabel, and how much time or how much attention it deserves. It seems to me that it might be a key, it might be irrelevant, but well, it's not irrelevant, but he wasn't simply in love with a woman. The question I have to ask is, what was this woman to him? What did she represent to him? What did she mean to him? She was not a separate whole individual in relation to whom he had an equal partnership.
I like, Garth, what you said about obsession, and I think it's really one of the key words for Lachaise. And when Louise Bourgeois, who was very fond of him, wrote an essay about Lachaise, she said she kind of criticized the fact that in his portraits, which were one of his main and public productions, he was somehow repeating himself. He was a slave to his talent. That's what she says. And his style didn't evolve. But what makes him a great sculptor is precisely this obsession. She says that's what is fantastic about Lachaise. And she pushes this idea even further into his personal life. And she says that he was basically a masochist. And he was just celebrating this woman and enjoying the suffering as well. Oh, I love this assemblage of the different body parts.
Mm-hmm.
That's the original plaster that the bronze was made from.
Wow. And you can see in this floating woman that she's really basically an assemblage. There's really the torso, the legs, and the arms, and it's almost mechanic. She's very different from the rest of his sculptures and how they're composed, I believe.
Yeah, I wouldn't know about that, but yeah, one of the things that struck me about this piece is that extraordinary kind of right angle between the thighs and legs and the torso and head. They just come together in an extraordinary kind of an absolute right angle.
In that previous photograph, you see how thick the dust is on the plaster.
Yeah.
It was shot before the bronze was made. I mean, it hadn't been touched for God knows how long.
Yeah.
Well, 7 years, all right.
Yeah, maybe. Well, it seems so. It seems so because it seems to be the very same service that's in the Brummer installation shots.
Yeah, I think in terms of this piece being sort of a one-off, what you were saying, Choghakate, it is important that most of the figures that I'm aware of, female nude figures, like the one you referenced, the woman on her tiptoes, are in many ways, although they have all the, you know, all the characteristics of a female body, they are very masculine in their presence.
Yeah.
Which makes them very complicated, I think, because they're both, you know, the parts are very clearly defined, and at the same time, the total is something else. This is one of the presumably things he was making privately. Were these shown in the show, Brandt, at the Museum of Modern Art?
No, no. A number of standing figurines were. The mountain was, the heroic woman, the elevation. I presume there were a bunch of portraits, but in the catalog essay, the curator, Lincoln Kirstein, made a point of saying that he had not included a lot of work that simply could not be exhibited in public. And so in a way, he makes them part of the exhibition.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they are extraordinary things, aren't they? I mean, really, in some ways, just breathtaking.
Yeah, and you know, in a funny way, they don't feel very private.
Could you say more on that subject? What do you mean by that? They don't feel very private.
I think it's something in part in Lachaise's hand that, you know, is as kind of facile an artist as he was. I find that many times many times, not always, his touch is kind of indifferent. And I don't know, I don't sense him finding those forms, dwelling on those forms. I mean, this shot actually is maybe a little different there. And also I find that in those later pieces, the subject matter, call it that, is, you know, it's not happy. And how does one go through what really is an enormous psychic effort of naming these things blatantly, you know, in 3 dimensions, more or less as they come out of the artist's head. I mean, it leaves a certain kind of, you know, barren exhaustion in its wake, I would imagine. And I think some of these smaller later pieces were not developed either, which, you know, at that point, maybe they would have become a little more tender. That one little figurine of the woman holding her arms out, and they kind of, you know, meld somehow with her very large wing-like breasts is an exception to that. But there's something, it's harsh is not the word, but it's like there's something a little bit
cold
about those pieces.
Sorry, I missed that, Brandt.
It's something a little bit barren about those very, you know, nervy, solitary, late things of his.
Yeah, is cold an alternative to barren?
Yeah. And Sandy Schwartz says that there was a certain cold center in Lachaise.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because they're almost, I mean, they're almost cartoon-like, aren't they? I mean, they're not cartoons, but they feel like something that could have been taken from some kind of, I guess,
Yeah, and it's consistent with this idea of virtuoso. This stuff just came out. He didn't overwork anything. He didn't. You talked about something. He didn't struggle over the forms, Brandt. But he really didn't. He wasn't interested in getting involved that way. You know, he wasn't interested in thinking too much about this stuff. It just leapt out of him, and he was delighted that it leapt out of him. Or I get I do sense a degree of some kind of joy that he was really happy to produce this stuff.
I agree with you, I think, and Marsden Hartley, who knew well Lachaise and his wife because they had a house in Maine that was next to each other, and Hartley qualified Lachaise as the sculptor of the joyous moment. I don't know if he saw the late work or only the public work, but actually I like this idea of private work, not so much for the iconography, but for the environment and the condition of creation, because he had this two different types of production, the public and the private. And the fact that he would have a day job and produce for commissions and for money during the day. I mean, at least that's what the legend says, that, and then he was working on these small, what we call private pieces at night. And basically for no financial reasons, it was really personal in that sense that it was for him. And he had at that stage no intention of selling them, no commissions, and these works were never shown. So it was really, he was just producing this as, I believe that he had this career as a professional sculptor, which he was, and he was technically really good. And also he was an artist as an outsider artist almost for this late work. And he was working as an outsider as a pastime, which is very strange because he had this double career of a professional sculptor and more as an amateur sculptor, in the sense that it was just as a pastime and wasn't in a professional, circle and network.
Well, I mean, I understand that. And I understand what Jock is saying about the sense in which he did not intellectualize about this work. Jock says he didn't think about it. I'm not sure quite what Jock means by that, but he didn't. It wasn't coming out of some theoretical, conceptual position that he sorted out for himself.
That's for sure.
At the same time, I mean, he must have been aware that at least in some ways he was challenging taboos, wasn't he? I mean, in that, as you said, Brandt, some of this work could not be exhibited publicly, at least according to,
Kirstein.
Yeah. Who must have seen everything.
Who must have seen everything, right?
I think so.
Yeah. So I mean that sense in which there was a taboo that he was in some way engaging could not have escaped him.
Right, and he was friends with, Choghakate says, he lived next door to Hartley. He was friends with a lot of sophisticated modern artists for whom a big public audience just wasn't in the cards.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and I believe also it has to do this little different. I mean, although he was in the circle, he was still not part of the avant-garde, like not in the top 10 avant-garde. Probably also because of the nature of sculpture. I mean, it's kind of a cliche, but I believe it has its reasons. Like sculpture is always a little behind of painting, and why? I mean, Arturo Martini wrote this essay about sculpture's dead language, because we had this feeling that sculpture is left behind as the language of monuments and public commissions. And I believe there's always this complexity. I mean, sculpture is a very difficult medium.
Yeah, I think that's a very, important and for me interesting and Choghakate point of which, because sculpture is inevitably a more public mode of expression than painting, and so it has inevitably, got to negotiate more with, with current mores than painting, and so it possibly could be said to lag behind in that sense, being more in tune with, or having to be more accommodating to, what's acceptable. I don't just mean acceptable in terms of morals, but just acceptable aesthetically than painting. It would be interesting to have an exhibition, wouldn't it, of these late pieces.
Oh yes.
Brandt, Brandt, are there many of them? We're looking at pictures of 3 or 4 here, but is there a lot?
Yeah, there's more. And some of them, I think, even though some were cast in the 60s and 70s, I think there's yet a couple more that were cast even more recently.
Yeah, and in the 90s, there were at least one, I think more than one show at Salander O'Reilly that
and Chime and Reed.
Sorry?
Chime and Reed later as well. Okay.
Yeah. So there have been exhibitions of this stuff.
Well, I missed them.
Yeah.
It's with regard to that precedence between painting and sculpture. It's interesting that Bourgeois looked on Lachaise as a kind of a precursor, or maybe a kind of a patron saint of some kind. And the funny thing there, although she doesn't say anything about it in her essay, her work is about the family romance, and you kind of, I have to wonder if Lachaise's work is not a lot more about his birth family than is mentioned.
Say more, Brandt. His family?
Yeah, his mother and father, and I think he had just one sister, maybe he had 2 sisters. I don't quite remember. But I wonder how much of it has to do with that nuclear family, before meeting Isabel.
Mm. Well, it would have its origins there. Whatever the obsession was would have to have its origins there, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
This dichotomy between a kind of public presence that I think Choghakate was talking about most clearly, and a private practice is interesting as well. And that is something that maybe was rare then and has always been rare, but it speaks again to the sense in which the work that he was doing, as it were, for his own personal attempt to manifest his being, was not, he didn't, and presumably didn't feel it was something that was publicly acceptable or commercially viable.
Yeah.
And
outsider by night.
And it seems also that most of these private works were small in scale. I mean, I remember Brandt brought me to the Lachaise Foundation storage, and we spent a lot of time looking at it. They're actually small. I mean, most of what we saw are really tiny pieces. And somehow maybe it also gave him more freedom just to work in small, tiny, I mean, less technically constraining and less tiring. So he was working on these very small works.
Yeah, and being small, they're able to be made relatively quickly.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they all, most of them are body parts. He was really interested in the body, but in separate pieces. And not, I have to feel not so much entirely, but even when he does like here, an entire body, it's always one part that is really coming forward. It's always the central part of the body he was interested in.
Yeah, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it. I mean, it was certain parts of the body that engaged engaged him. Engaged his what? I don't know, but engaged him. And not the whole body so much, you know, not the, you know, I mean, I don't know, I don't want to get too, psychological, but Rachel, you haven't said anything. Well, I'm wondering how, you know, as a woman, you respond to this kind of obsession with womanhood or whatever it is.
There are a couple of things that you all said that resonated in the beginning. And one, Garth, I think it was you, where his obsession definitely predated Isabel. And I think he found like a vessel for it when he met her, which would explain their somewhat whirlwind and rather unconventional romance for the time. But I'm not even sure it had to do with like women, like actual real people. And I don't have, like, the more you look at his work, I don't have a good handle on like what like it manifested in a female or a caricatured female form, but I don't think it had to do with women generally. And I think that's why these figures are, I mean, gender ambiguous. I mean, if you look at some of them, I mean, the build on what you would think of as a woman figure, other than like the very small waist and the breasts and the hips, which are kind of, you know, indicators of being female, they've got, you know, big shoulders and muscles and masculine features. It's there's something else there, and I don't know. And Floating Woman in particular, when I first saw it, when I was walking up, my kind of gut reaction was like, you know, oh great, another like homage to, you know, fertility, yay. But the more I looked at it, in a lot of respects, it reminded me of some of the African sculptures that we discussed a couple of weeks ago from the Sahel, where she really, by virtue of the way that the torso and kind of like the breastbone and like where her head is situated, like she projects an awful lot of power outward, and a number of his sculptures do. So I think like there's something to that too. Like I don't know exactly, but these aren't, you know, shrinking women on a pedestal that, you know, are being fetishized. Like I think there's something else there.
So does that strike you? I mean, how does it feel? Does it seem honoring womanhood?
Well, I guess I think it's so far removed. Like I don't think it's a fetish, and I don't think that he's belittling them, and I don't think he's even doing sculptures of women and being like, I'm going to give them power. Like I'm not sure they're women, I guess is why. That's kind of like, I know that they have features that, as Garth said, you seem to be obsessed with, that are very feminine associated, but I'm not convinced that's exactly what they are. Like they're a step removed in either spirit or nature or something, how he viewed them, or in his exploration from just women.
I think that's fascinating. Yeah, I think you touched on something there that I feel, you know, they're almost become symbols of something, and exactly what is not. clear.
It seems that he was not so much interested in women in general than actual flesh. That's what you see, this kind of abundance of flesh that is growing and growing. And there's this very curious culture called burlesque. And there's a real protuberance on the right hip that has no anatomical reason. It's just an expansion of flesh. And I kind of, I was thinking about his drawings that are as amazing as his sculpture. And since Jock reminded us about Renoir, I had thought that maybe also on a flat surface, he had also many opportunities to expand this flesh, like literally. And I mean, drawing and painting are easier, you know, are more fluid as a medium. And in Lachaise's drawing, you have this real expansion in space of this body's flesh. And probably that's the reason why he preferred women's body, because literally there's more flesh. And when you see how he sculpted men's figure, they're very dry. And you can see he's not interested in that. It's too dry for him. There's no interest in it. He liked the folds of the flesh. That's what he was interested in. There are artists who are interested in textile fabrics folds and in this drapé, but he was interested in the folds of the flesh that he could find in Isabel's body or the body type he created.
Yeah, that's an interesting. I mean, I appreciate what you say, Choghakate, and it goes back to something I think Jock was talking about. You know, I mean, there is some potential equivalence between clay and flesh, soft clay and flesh, and the translation of one into the other. Yeah, okay. I don't know. Do we have a lot more to say? Does anybody want to add something we've missed?
You know, when his kind of in effect narcissism came up, it occurred to me that he's making these figures as much to put something between himself and the other person as he is making a kind of idol of another person. Well, it's almost like he's making these images as much to put an obstacle between himself, to put some distance between himself and another person as he is to sort of celebrate another person. Because I think there really is something in that sense that his figures aren't male or female.
You mean the face that is more masculine face than with a female body?
No, it's more than that. I think that the body of the floating woman, although you know, like her feet are, you know, kind of annoyingly slipper-like, overall it's peculiarly masculine.
Well, it isn't masculine, I don't think. I mean, I think you were right earlier, or someone was right earlier. It was maybe Choghakate said it's more, you know, more sea lion than human. It's neither masculine nor feminine in a sense. It's more like some creature, some, and you know, creature that would live partly in the water. I mean, apart from the head. Which is very human.
You know, the volume of her arms and upper body, and that you know, the close, you know, contoured shape of her head they're incipiently masculine, I think. I mean, I think it's one of the interesting things about that piece. How sort of supra gender she is.
Yeah.
It's a very ambiguous work, I think, in terms of gender, form, animal, human, but also at the same time, because it's really transition between two different types of production, and also because she seems also hybrid, because it's really different body parts brought together as an assemblage. And I think that also makes it so strange, the torso and the legs assembled together.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I ended up, after my visit to see her, after my initial kind of approach and thinking, oh, this is joyful, I ended up walking away and thinking it was not actually joyful at all.
No, I wouldn't say it's joyful. I also believe it's really strange. No.
Yeah, maybe delightful was my initial kind of thought. I'm going to, when I saw it, as it were, in the distance coming around the corner, I thought, oh, this is delightful, this thing. And then, it was just its kind of flowing sense of it. And then the more time I spent with it, the more I began to feel it was not at all joyful or delightful. That there was something quite else going on. And I think, Brandt, you put your finger on it in some way in your piece about this suggesting that it was in some way kind of forlorn and despairing, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, but in addition, I agree with you about qualifying this joyful business, but I like the way Rachael brought back the African stuff and the sense in which sculpture has this role of kind of power and it's the power that is disturbing, and the sense in which this piece is kind of demanding that the public sort of get in line, or that it inspires sort of fear in the people that look at it, is, well, that's the way I would complicate the joyfulness.
Okay.
I like this expression, complicate the joyfulness. I think that really defines Lachaise. Complicated joyfulness.
Problematic, I think. Anyway, okay, yes. I think, should we leave it?
Yep.
Sure, that's great.
Thank you. I think that was good. Thank you, everybody.